Welcome, traveler, to another night of timeless tales. You've just arrived at Sleeping Legends, where stories from the shadows of history come to life beneath the stars. Globe showing Europe, Africa. But before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? What country do you call home? And what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing how far our legends travel. Fire. Tonight, we journey back to a time of long winters and dim candlelight. A time when survival wasn't guaranteed, and every ember mattered. How did medieval peasants, without central heating or modern comforts, brave the coldest, most unforgiving nights? Ear of rice. Was it just wool and firewood, or was there more to their quiet strength? Get cozy, wrap yourself in a blanket, and let's uncover the clever, sometimes surprising ways they endured those frost-bitten hours. Red Heart Hash. If you enjoy stories like this, ancient, strange, and soothing, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to Sleeping Legends, and tap the bell so you never miss a midnight tale. Books. Be sure to check out our other stories waiting just for you. Tales of forgotten kings, haunted castles, and myths whispered through time. Tonight, we're diving into the world of medieval dating. And let me tell you, forget everything Hollywood told you. This wasn't knights serenading maidens under moonlight. It was, well, let's just say if Tinder had been invented back then, your profile pic would probably be your family's pig herd. So before you get too comfortable, smash that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though, not porridge, trust me, and let's jump in. You wake up in a drafty hut. The air smells like smoke, sweat, and that one cow that refuses to leave the kitchen. You stretch, scratch, and remember, you're single. Again. But dating isn't about sliding into DMs. Nope. In medieval Europe, your love life is basically a three-player game. You, your parents, and the local priest. Spoiler alert, you don't get the final say. Marriage was less about true love and more about land, alliances, and survival. Like a very awkward Monopoly game where instead of hotels, you're bargaining with goats. Picture this, you're at a village festival. Ale is flowing, somebody's juggling badly, and you spot someone across the field. Do you flirt? Maybe, but forget smooth pickup lines. Instead, you might toss them an apple. Yes, an apple. And if they catch it, congratulations, you're basically halfway to marriage. Romantic, right? Of course, sometimes it wasn't that simple. Nobles had entire rituals. A knight might dedicate a joust to a lady, risking his life just to impress her. Meanwhile, peasants were like, look, I've got 3 chickens and half a roof, what more do you want? Now, here's where it gets fun, the church. They weren't just officiating weddings, they were micromanaging your entire love life. Want to marry your cousin? Nope. But wait, everyone in your tiny village is basically your cousin. So you need a special papal dispensation. Good luck writing that awkward request. And forget secret Vegas weddings. Marriage wasn't valid unless everyone in the community knew. Which meant if you eloped, people assumed it was basically a hookup gone wrong. Now, what about impressing your crush? Forget roses and chocolates. The medieval gift game was intense. A guy might offer gloves, ribbons, or if you're lucky, a whole bloody deer carcass. And hygiene? Let's just say, bathing was not a daily routine. Imagine trying to flirt when both of you smell like turnips and old leather. Comment below if you think you'd survive a medieval first date, or would you tap out after 5 minutes? Let's say you survived the courtship, the priest, and the apple toss. Congrats, you're married. But don't expect a fairy tale honeymoon. Peasant weddings were often just a feast, ale, bread, maybe a pig roast if you're fancy. Nobles, on the other hand, turned weddings into political power plays. Think less happily ever after and more Game of Thrones alliance strategy. And remember, love wasn't always part of the package. Many couples grew into affection over time. Or, they didn't. Divorce? Basically impossible. Hope you like your spouse, because you're stuck until death. And in the Middle Ages, that might only be about 10 years, So, silver lining. So, what's the takeaway here? Dating in medieval times was messy, smelly, and almost never about romance. But, human beings still found ways to flirt, fall in love, and sneak kisses behind barns. It's a reminder that even in the muddiest, strictest times, people were still, well, people. Wanting connection. Wanting someone to laugh with, or at least share a mug of ale with. So next time you're stressing over a text that says K instead of OK, just remember, it could be worse. You could be waiting 6 months for your crush to toss you an apple. Alright, so you're married now. Congrats. You survived the apple toss courtship, the priest's suspicious side eye, and the wedding feast where Uncle Geoffrey drank too much mead and fell into the pigpen. But now comes the part no ballad ever sings about, life after the vows. You wake up next to your spouse in a straw bed that scratches more than it comforts. Privacy? Forget it. Your whole family might share the same one-room hut, and if you're lucky enough for separate sleeping quarters, the livestock is usually in there too. Nothing says romance like making eye contact with a goat while you're trying to, you know. As a wife, your to-do list reads like a nightmare chore chart. Cook, clean, make cloth, care for kids, feed the animals, brew ale, and oh yeah, don't forget to survive childbirth at least once every couple of years. As a husband, your job is to work the fields, pay taxes to your lord, and not get murdered in the next war. Super romantic. And here's the kicker, love was nice if you had it, but survival was mandatory. You weren't expected to whisper sweet nothings so much as keep the family alive through winter. And honestly, that's still hotter than a guy who just texts WA at 3 a.m. But let's be real, human beings are messy. Affairs absolutely happened. Among nobles, mistresses were practically part of the deal. Kings like Henry II openly kept lovers, and their queens were expected to just cope. For peasants, sneaking around was way riskier. Your whole village knew your business. And if you got caught, the punishment could be anything from a fine to public humiliation, or worse. So yeah, when people talk about the romance of knights and courtly love, remember, half the time those poems were about someone else's wife. Imagine if Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, but Juliet was already married to Greg from accounting. Okay, so let's rewind a little. You're not married yet, you're still trying to flirt. What are the rules? The big buzzword here was courtly love. It was this elaborate, often ridiculous code of behavior invented by troubadours in the 12th century. Think of it as the medieval version of TikTok trends. Everyone claimed to know the rules, but no one was actually good at it. The idea was that a knight proved his devotion to a lady by suffering nobly. He'd pine, he'd sigh dramatically, he'd write terrible poetry about her hair being like golden threads. Basically, emo lyrics with a lute. And the lady? She was supposed to reject him, politely, over and over. The tension was the point. Which is hilarious, because in practice, the whole system was like one giant friend zone generator. But here's the thing no troubadour song tells you, everybody stank. Bathing was occasional at best, teeth cleaning was with sticks, and deodorant was non-existent. You're out there trying to flirt while your breath smells like garlic and bad ale, and your crush hasn't washed her hair since the last equinox. Oh, and don't forget diseases. Everything from fleas to the plague was lurking around. Want to impress someone? Step 1. Don't die of dysentery first. Honestly, next time you complain about a bad Tinder date, just be grateful you didn't have to worry about smallpox pustules as a deal breaker. Now let's talk about festivals, the medieval version of spring break. Picture it, music, food, ale flowing, and fewer rules than usual. These were prime opportunities for young people to mingle, flirt, and, let's be honest, hook up. Games like Kiss in the Ring weren't just innocent fun, they were excuses to literally steal kisses in front of everyone. And then there were May Day festivals, where couples would disappear into the woods for, flower picking. Yeah, definitely flowers. Of course, if you were royalty or nobility, your dating life was on another level of drama. Marriages were almost always arranged for political gain. Imagine being 14, barely old enough to know what's happening, and suddenly you're shipped off to marry a complete stranger in another country. But here's the twist. Some royal couples did fall in love. Edward IV of England, for example, shocked everyone by marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, because he was actually into her. It was like if Prince Harry married your barista. Oh wait. Now, not to be all doom and gloom, but love in the Middle Ages could be deadly. If you crossed the wrong family, if your marriage contract was disputed, or if your affair got exposed, the consequences weren't just gossip, they could be executions. Noble women caught in adultery sometimes faced brutal punishments. Men, meanwhile, often got a slap on the wrist. Shocking, I know. So yeah, forget heartbreak. Dating in medieval times could literally get you killed. So what do we take away from all this? Dating in the Middle Ages was complicated, smelly, dangerous, political, and rarely about personal choice. And yet, people still fell in love. They still carved initials into tree bark, wrote awkward poems, snuck glances across the feast hall. Strip away the armor, the mud, the plagues, and the longing is the same. We all want connection. Whether it's tossing an apple at your crush or swiping right on Bumble, the human heart hasn't really changed. So, question for you. Would you survive medieval dating, or would you rather roll the dice on plague season? Let me know in the comments. And hey, if you enjoyed this little time travel trip, hit like, subscribe for more history deep dives, and share this with someone who thinks chivalry is dead. Spoiler, it was never alive in the way you think. So you think modern dating apps are awkward? Try the medieval version, the matchmaker. In villages, older women often played Cupid, though instead of swiping right, they were more like, you've got 2 healthy cows, she's got strong arms for plowing. Perfect match. Among nobles, things were even more transactional. Marriage contracts were drawn up like business deals. Dowries, land rights, political alliances, it was less rom-com and more Wall Street, but with chainmail. And get this, sometimes parents arranged a marriage when the kids were still toddlers. Imagine being 3 years old, finger painting with mud, and your dad's already like, by the way, you're marrying Lord Edmund's daughter in 15 years. No pressure. But what if you didn't want to wait for destiny, or your parents, to pick your partner? Enter medieval love magic. People believed in charms, potions, and spells to win affection. You might sprinkle powdered herbs in someone's drink, or wear an amulet carved with mysterious symbols. Of course, sometimes the ingredients were less than appetizing. Recipes called for things like powdered rabbit heart, or even drops of your own blood. Romantic, right? And don't get caught. The church considered this sorcery, which meant you weren't just desperate, you were possibly a heretic. That's like using a sketchy dating hack and accidentally getting tried for witchcraft. Now, imagine you're a knight sent off on crusade, or a merchant traveling across Europe. How do you keep the romance alive? Letters. Handwritten, wax-sealed, painstakingly delivered by someone on horseback who might get robbed halfway there. A love letter could take months to arrive. And by the time it did, your crush might already be married to someone else. But when they did work, medieval letters were intense. Flowery declarations, religious imagery, promises of eternal devotion. If you think modern texts are dramatic, I can't live without you, babe. Imagine reading 6 pages about how your soul is incomplete without the other person, with 3 Bible quotes thrown in for good measure. And not all medieval dating looked the same. Let's take a quick tour. In France and Italy, troubadours spread the idea of courtly love, noble ladies, knights in shining armor, and endless sighing. In Scandinavia, Viking culture still lingered, and sagas included fiery women who chose their husbands based on bravery and strength. Translation: bring your axe, not your apple. In the Middle East, under Islamic empires, poetry and song celebrated romance in ways Europeans sometimes copied later. Think elaborate metaphors about gardens, stars, and longing. So yeah, your experience of medieval love depended heavily on where you lived. It wasn't one size fits all, it was more like a messy playlist with wildly different vibes. Let's talk about serenades. You've probably seen the Hollywood version. Night under the window, lute in hand, lady swooning above. Cute idea. But the truth. Half the time the lady was rolling her eyes because she'd heard the same recycled lyrics 100 times. Still, music and poetry were powerful tools of romance. If you were literate, or had the coin to pay a minstrel, you could immortalize your crush in verse. That's like dedicating a Spotify playlist, except it was sung badly in the rain while the neighbors yelled at you to shut up. Of course, love has always been messy. People sneaked around. Secret marriages happened, sometimes in defiance of parents, sometimes out of desperation. There's a case in 14th century England where a couple literally married in a ditch because no church would allow it. Nothing says romance like mud and worms. But secrecy was risky. If your union wasn't public, it could be invalid, which meant your kids could be declared illegitimate, basically cut off from inheritance. Medieval gossip wasn't just embarrassing, it could ruin your entire bloodline. Now, let's get serious for a second. How much choice did women actually have? For peasant women, sometimes surprisingly more. They could meet partners at markets, festivals, or in the fields, and while families still had opinions, marriages could be based on mutual choice. For noble women, forget it. Their value was measured in land, dowry, and alliances. Many were married off as teenagers. Consent wasn't really part of the vocabulary. And yet, some women found ways to push back. Letters survive of noble ladies refusing unwanted suitors, or even running away with lovers. Rebellion wasn't common, but it happened. Love, after all, has always been stubborn. As the Middle Ages faded and the Renaissance dawned, ideas about romance began to shift. Literature started celebrating love as a personal, emotional experience, not just a transaction. Think Dante pining for Beatrice, or Petrarch writing endless sonnets for Laura. Marriage was still mostly arranged, but slowly, very slowly, the idea of marrying for love gained ground. By the 16th century, plays like those by Shakespeare captured the chaos of passion, the defiance of young lovers, and the eternal battle between family duty and personal desire. Basically, medieval dating walked so Romeo and Juliet could run. So, what's the moral here? Dating in the Middle Ages was a mashup of politics, superstition, awkward rituals, and occasional sparks of real human connection. Yes, it was muddy, dangerous, and often unfair, but it also gave us the roots of romantic ideals that we still cling to today. The apple toss, the bad poetry, the risky love letters, they're the ancestors of your awkward texts, your Valentine's chocolates, your late-night you-up messages. At the core, the human need hasn't changed. We all want to be chosen, to be seen, to be loved, even if it means risking embarrassment, or, in medieval terms, the plague. So I'll leave you with this. If you had to time travel back to the Middle Ages, would you risk it for romance? Or would you just join a monastery and call it a day? Drop your answer in the comments. So, you've survived the flirting stage, dodged the priest's cousin check, and your families strike a deal. Welcome to the medieval engagement ceremony. Forget diamond rings. Those were centuries away. Instead, you might exchange a coin, a kiss, or even a handful of dirt. Yeah, dirt. Because property was everything, and that soil symbolized the land you'd share, or more accurately, the land your families controlled. And the community always had to know. Sometimes you'd stand at the church door, holding hands while witnesses asked if you really wanted this. Say yes loud enough, and bam, you're legally bound. Congratulations, you just got betrothed at the same place people came to gossip and trade turnips. Now let's talk money. Because love is nice, but in the Middle Ages, dowries were the real power move. If you were a bride, your family had to cough up a bundle: cash, land, livestock, linens, even a bed. Basically, you were a walking medieval Kickstarter campaign. No dowry, good luck finding a husband, unless you joined a convent. And if you were a groom, you had to promise a bride price or mourning gift. That was money or property the woman would control if you died. Which, given average life expectancy, was less if and more when. Dowries caused family feuds, bankruptcies, and sometimes wars. Imagine your love life being put on hold because your uncle still hasn't paid off his goat debt. Weddings weren't always fairy tales. Sometimes, they went completely off the rails. Picture this: the feast is going strong, the ale's flowing, the musicians are halfway through their 10th terrible ballad, and then someone challenges someone else over unpaid debts. Next thing you know, it's a brawl, the groom's cousin is bleeding, and the pig roast is on fire. And remember, people had to celebrate in public, so everyone, including the village idiot and that one uncle who always ruins things, was there. Weddings were less about solemn vows and more about keeping chaos just barely under control. Which feels a lot like some modern weddings, doesn't it? But what if your romance didn't follow the rules? Medieval justice had a flair for the dramatic. Caught cheating? You might be paraded through town, half naked, while people threw rotten food at you. Tried to elope without permission? Some towns dunked couples in rivers as punishment. Romantic in theory, hypothermia in practice. One German town had a device called the couple's collar. Two lovers caught misbehaving were locked into an iron yoke, forced to stand face to face in public until they either reconciled or collapsed. Imagine being trapped 2 inches from your ex's face while the whole village laughs. Honestly, that's worse than ghosting. Here's something history books often skip. Same-sex relationships absolutely existed. Medieval Europe was complicated. On the one hand, the church officially condemned homosexual acts. On the other hand, records show deep male friendships, passionate letters between women, and even ceremonies some historians argue resembled same-sex unions. Of course, these relationships had to be hidden, or coded in poetry and song. Imagine being in love but only able to express it through metaphors about falcons or roses. Subtle, heartbreaking, and very medieval. So yeah, romance wasn't always straight, even if the official records tried to pretend otherwise. And here's something surprising. Widows often had more freedom in love than young brides. If your husband died, and statistically, he probably would, you suddenly controlled his property. That gave you bargaining power. You could choose to remarry, or not. Some widows ran businesses, others strategically picked new husbands, and some just enjoyed being left alone for once. In a way, widowhood was the medieval version of hitting your 30s and finally dating on your own terms. Hard-won independence, but independence nonetheless. Love didn't stop at death. At least, not in medieval imagination. Folklore is packed with ghostly lovers, spirits who return to visit their beloved, or curses that doomed couples who broke promises. In some tales, a dead partner literally climbed out of the grave to demand loyalty. Romantic. Creepy. You decide. Superstitions warned against making oaths of eternal love at crossroads or graveyards, because apparently the dead took those vows very seriously. So next time you whisper forever to someone, at least be glad you don't have to worry about skeletons showing up at your door to enforce it. So what's left after all this mud, dowry drama, and questionable hygiene? Dating in the Middle Ages was never simple. It was a battlefield of tradition, survival, superstition, and, occasionally, real affection. Some people endured arranged marriages, some rebelled, some turned to magic, some wrote poems that sound way too intense for first dates. But through it all, one truth stands: people found ways to love, to connect, to sneak glances across crowded feasts, to trade tokens in secret, to risk everything for the chance at companionship. And that, weirdly, makes medieval dating feel closer to us than we think. Because under all the dirt and drama, the human heart hasn't changed. So here's my question for you. If you lived back then, would you risk the scandals, the superstitions, and the goat dowries for love? Or would you just keep your head down and join a monastery? Okay, let's say you're madly in love in the 13th century. How do you prove it? Forget chocolates or playlists. You're expected to suffer. Knights sometimes took vows of silence for their lady. Not for a day. Not for a week. Sometimes for years. Imagine trying to flirt by dramatically staring while everyone else wonders if you've lost your tongue. Others swore to wear their lady's token, maybe a ribbon, a glove, or even, in one famous case, her undergarments, into battle. So yeah, chivalry wasn't just holding the door. It was risking your spleen while waving someone's underwear as a flag. Romantic and ridiculous. Here's one of the weirdest bits of medieval love culture: the so-called courts of love. In 12th century France, noblewomen, sometimes even Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, held mock trials where cases of love were debated. Did a knight show enough devotion? Was a lady cruel or fair in rejecting him? What counted as betrayal? The judgments were playful, often satirical, but they also shaped ideas of etiquette and romance. Basically, medieval women were running the first reality TV dating shows, complete with gossip, verdicts, and public humiliation. Honestly, The Bachelor owes them royalties. Romance wasn't just personal, it was seasonal. May Day was famous for Greenwood marriages, where couples slipped into the woods for a day of, let's call it, bonding with nature. Babies born 9 months later were jokingly called Children of May. Harvest festivals were prime dating events. Nothing says courtship like bonding over bushels of grain. In winter, long evenings by the hearth gave rise to storytelling games, some of which had, let's say, suspiciously flirty forfeits. So yeah, the medieval calendar doubled as a dating calendar. If you wanted love, you didn't check Tinder, you checked the feast days. Now, buckle up, because medieval medicine had thoughts about love. Doctors believed attraction was tied to the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you fell in love, it wasn't passion, it was your blood overheating. Love was literally considered a fever. There was even a diagnosis: amor-herios, or lovesickness. Symptoms: insomnia, weight loss, staring off into space like an idiot. The cure: prayer, herbal remedies, or, this one's real, forcing the patient to smell unpleasant things until they snapped out of it. Imagine going to the doctor for heartbreak and getting prescribed rotten cabbage. But remember, medieval Europe wasn't a closed box. Crusades, trade routes, and pilgrimages brought people into contact with very different cultures. Italian merchants in the East wrote home about dazzling fashion, perfumes, and poetry they'd never seen before. French knights returned with tales of courtly rituals borrowed from Arabic traditions. Even food, sugar, spices, coffee, added a new spark to social life, and yes, dating. Love was global long before dating apps. You just had to risk a plague ship or a siege to meet someone new. Now here's a juicy angle. What about the clergy? Monks and nuns were supposed to renounce earthly love. But they were still human. Records are full of scandals: abbots caught with mistresses, nuns sneaking out to meet lovers, even entire convents accused of turning into social clubs. Not all true, of course. Sometimes rumors were political weapons. But enough was real to make church authorities panic. Some priests tried to justify their crushes by writing theology about divine love. Translation: I'm not obsessed with Sister Agnes, I'm just contemplating the eternal beauty of God through her eyes. Aha. Sure. Medieval people weren't always serious about love, they made fun of it, too. Fabliaux, short, bawdy French tales, mocked cheating wives, gullible husbands, and priests chasing skirts. Think of them as medieval sitcoms with way more manure jokes. One story features a wife tricking her husband into believing a man in their bed was actually the family's priest delivering a blessing. Another ends with a suitor falling into a latrine while trying to sneak into a woman's room. Romantic comedy, medieval edition, 80% slapstick, 20% feces. Did you know medieval courts sometimes had to prove whether a marriage was consummated? Yes, lawyers were involved. There are actual cases where judges ordered couples to demonstrate in front of witnesses, or, at the very least, submit to extremely invasive questioning about their bedroom life. Imagine your love life being cross-examined by your nosy neighbors with a quill in hand. And annulments. They happened, but only with serious cause: impotence, extreme kinship, or, my favorite excuse, bewitchment. Apparently, blaming sorcery was the medieval version of saying, "It's not you, it's my horoscope." So why does this matter? Because so many of our modern love myths trace back to the Middle Ages. The idea of suffering for love, of dramatic gestures, of poetry and tokens, it's all medieval. Even Valentine's Day became popular thanks to 14th century poets who tied romance to St. Valentine's feast. So every time you buy roses, write a love song, or binge-watch a rom-com, you're echoing traditions that began centuries ago, in smoky halls and muddy fields. Dating in the Middle Ages wasn't a fairy tale. It was a mix of rituals, rules, risks, and ridiculousness. From dowries to love potions, from festivals to scandals, it was as messy as modern dating, just with more plague and fewer emojis. But if you squint past the dirt and superstition, you'll see the same heartbeat. People longed for connection, They found joy in small gestures, and they risked everything just to hold hands in a world that didn't make it easy. So maybe, when you think about medieval love, don't picture knights and castles. Picture yourself, nervous, hopeful, ridiculous, trying to impress someone with a bad joke and a stolen glance. Because honestly, that hasn't changed in 800 years. Picture this. You're crushing hard in 14th century Paris. Do you just walk up and talk? No, of course not. You ask an astrologer first. Astrology wasn't just fun, it was deadly serious. People believed your compatibility depended on planetary alignments. A noble might delay his wedding for weeks until the stars promised a favorable union. Imagine telling your partner, "Sorry, babe, Mercury's in retrograde, we can't tie the knot yet." Astrologers even wrote detailed guides. Libras were charming but indecisive, Scorpios were passionate but dangerous, and Capricorns, well, they were still Capricorns. Some things never change. Now, let's talk seduction medieval style. You might not have perfume counters or lingerie stores, but clothing was a weapon of love. Sleeves were a big deal. Long, flowing sleeves could be detached and gifted to a lover as a token. Ribbons, laces, and hoods also carried meaning. Wearing someone's colors was basically announcing, "Yeah, we're a thing." And shoes? Pointed toes were all the rage among the wealthy, so pointy they curled up like ski tips. Totally impractical, but if your crush notices your foot fashion, it was worth it. It's the medieval equivalent of flexing designer sneakers. Romance didn't pause for war. Soldiers, knights, and mercenaries often found partners on campaign. Camp followers, women who cooked, cleaned, and sometimes fought, were part of the mobile community. Relationships formed quickly. You might meet someone in the chaos of a siege, share stolen bread, and by morning, you're basically living as partners. Tender? Yes. Stable? Not so much. Armies moved constantly, and lovers were often left behind, or worse, widowed overnight. Still, letters from soldiers survive, scrawled on scraps of parchment, full of longing. Proof that even with death around the corner, people still made room for love. Romantic communication wasn't always about words. Objects carried hidden messages. Rings could be inscribed with mottos like Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Flowers were early love notes, red roses for passion, violets for faithfulness, rosemary for remembrance. Knots symbolized binding affection. Couples tied ribbons together as a public pledge. Even eating had codes. Offer someone a piece of bread from your own loaf, and it was more than polite, it was suggestive. Imagine sliding a breadstick across the table like, "Hey, you up?" Artists couldn't resist love stories. Manuscripts are full of tiny doodles of couples kissing in the margins, while massive tapestries showed courtships alongside hunting scenes. Why hunting? Because love was seen as a hunt. Your crush was the prey, your devotion the pursuit. Writers spun endless tales. Knights bewitched by fairies, peasants tricking priests for stolen kisses, noble ladies testing suitors with impossible tasks. Each story reminded listeners, love is glorious, but also ridiculous. And sometimes deadly. So yes, before Netflix, people binged romance through illuminated pages and bawdy songs in taverns. Speaking of taverns, if festivals were seasonal dating hubs, taverns were the everyday playground. Picture the scene. Smoky air, spilled ale, dice games in the corner. Farmers, merchants, traveling musicians, and maybe a cheeky nun in disguise. People mingled freely, boundaries blurred. Flirtation happened fast, sometimes a toast, sometimes a dance, sometimes a proposition. Of course, taverns were also where mistakes happened. Too much mead, and suddenly you're promising eternal love to someone whose name you can't remember in the morning. Medieval regret was real. Here's a side of medieval love we don't picture: older couples. Yes, people died young, but many lived into their 50s or 60s. Widows and widowers often remarried, not just for companionship, but for survival. And surprisingly, some second marriages were genuinely affectionate. Records show letters between older couples that sound sweet and practical. "I love you, and also thank you for mending my boots." Less fiery than the troubadour poems, but far more real. Maybe medieval late-life romance wasn't flashy, but it was steady, and honestly, that's its own kind of beauty. Love stories weren't always uplifting, they could be terrifying. Ballads warned of women who lured men into forests and left them to die, or men who seduced maidens only to vanish by dawn. Folklore blurred the line between romance and horror. One Welsh legend tells of a man who fell for a lake maiden. She agreed to marry him, on one condition: if he struck her 3 times, she'd vanish forever. Years later, after 3 accidental taps in frustration, she disappeared back into the lake, leaving him heartbroken. Moral: medieval people knew love could be magical, but also fragile and full of danger. Sometimes love wasn't private at all, it was a performance. Kings staged elaborate pageants of devotion. Knights jousted in their ladies' honor, wearing their scarves. Poets competed for who could write the most dramatic verse. Whole courts buzzed with gossip: who favored whom, who blushed, who rejected a dance. Love became a spectator sport. If you think social media overshares are bad, imagine your crush rejection being turned into a court-wide ballad performed at dinner. Brutal. By the end of the Middle Ages, love had evolved from transaction to something closer to our idea of romance. Literature celebrated choice and passion. Festivals codified traditions, like Valentine's Day. And artists painted lovers not just as political figures, but as human beings. Still, the lessons of medieval dating linger. Love is never simple. It's shaped by society, by money, by superstition. But at its heart, it's still that same nervous energy, that leap of faith, that desperate hope to be seen and chosen. And honestly, that's what makes it timeless. By day, flirting was risky, everyone was watching. But at night, that's when things got interesting. Many medieval villages practiced what's called night visiting. Young men would sneak into cottages to talk, or sometimes more, with young women. Families often turned a blind eye, as long as things didn't go too far. Imagine lying there with a stranger beside you, a heavy wool blanket trapping the smell of sweat, smoke, and maybe last night's onion stew. Romantic? Depends on your tolerance. Some families actually encouraged this as a way to test compatibility before marriage. Think of it as the medieval beta version of moving in together. Risky? Absolutely. But then again, so is Tinder. Pilgrimages weren't just spiritual journeys, they doubled as dating road trips. Tens of thousands of people set off across Europe to shrines like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela. Strangers met, walked together, shared food and stories. A long dusty road, a shared blanket, maybe a near-death encounter with bandits, it all created bonds. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is full of pilgrims flirting, gossiping, and scheming along the road. In other words, yes, people were looking for God, but also sometimes for a girlfriend. Imagine turning a holy relic tour into the medieval version of The Bachelor. Widowhood changed everything. A widow had more legal freedom than a young unmarried woman, and in many towns, she could control property and even choose her next partner. This made widows incredibly desirable. Suitors lined up, not just for affection, but for land and wealth. And yes, some widows played the game. Records show widows juggling multiple offers, delaying remarriage until they got the best deal. But there were also genuine late-life romances. Couples in their 40s and 50s exchanging practical, tender notes. Less about passion, more about partnership. Imagine DMing someone, "Your bread is excellent, and I would like to share ovens with you permanently." That's medieval love, baby. Of course, not everyone was honest. The medieval marriage market had its scammers. Professional matchmakers operated in cities, sometimes arranging unions for a fee. Most were legit, but a few swindlers promised wealthy brides who didn't exist, or lied about dowries. Court records tell us of men suing after discovering their noble bride was actually penniless. And just like today, catfishing existed. Families faked letters or portraits to exaggerate wealth and beauty. Imagine traveling 3 days to meet your slim, noble lady, only to find out she's broke, toothless, and her brother owes half the town money. Awkward. Even without texting, medieval lovers found ways to send messages. Letters survived between knights and ladies, full of longing and flowery metaphors. Some even slipped coded notes into prayer books, hidden between pages of psalms. Others used poetry. A troubadour might write a song, supposedly about a mythical lady, but everyone at court knew who it was really aimed at. And here's the kicker: letters were dangerous. If intercepted, they could ruin reputations or spark feuds. So sometimes lovers disguised their writing as business correspondence. Imagine hiding your love confession inside a fake grain shipment invoice. Smooth and sneaky. Music was Tinder with a lute. Folk dances brought people together, hands brushing in circles, eye contact held a little too long. Minstrels played cheeky songs that doubled as innuendo. One popular theme? Seducing someone by promising gifts, a ribbon, a bird, a pair of shoes. Sometimes women answered back in song, publicly roasting a suitor's lack of charm or his bad haircut. Imagine being dunked on through medieval karaoke in front of the whole village. Brutal, but effective deterrent. Doctors weren't just diagnosing fevers, they also prescribed remedies for love. One 12th century physician wrote that if you're lovesick, you should distract yourself with vigorous exercise, eat cooling foods like lettuce, and avoid red wine. Another suggested bloodletting. Yes, literally draining some of your blood to calm passion. And then there were aphrodisiacs, ground up roots, exotic spices, even powdered animal parts. Medieval medical texts are basically a mix of Tinder tips and questionable smoothie recipes. So the next time you feel heartbroken, at least no one's suggesting leeches on your forehead. Not every romance ended happily. Adulterers risked humiliation, sometimes literally paraded through town with mocking signs, or forced to ride backward on donkeys while the crowd laughed. One German city forced cheaters to wear ridiculous costumes with giant fake genitals. Medieval public shaming was savage. But scandals fascinated people. Gossip about who slept with whom spread faster than plague fleas. In fact, sermons constantly complained that people cared more about local affairs of the heart than about their immortal souls. Some things never change. Dating felt very different depending on where you lived. In the countryside, options were limited. Maybe 5 eligible singles within walking distance. Everyone knew everyone's business. Privacy? Forget it. Courtship often meant long walks after harvest, or helping each other in fields. Practical, steady, a little boring. In cities, though, things got spicy. Crowded streets, festivals, taverns, guild gatherings. You could reinvent yourself, flirt with strangers, or disappear into the crowd. Urban love was faster, riskier, and more theatrical. Basically, medieval small-town dating versus big-city hookups. Romance might be universal, but it was also fragile. During famines, dating practically froze. People delayed marriage because they couldn't afford dowries or households. Songs survive where young women sing about hunger ruining their chances of finding husbands. Climate crises like the Little Ice Age hit hard. Crops failed, disease spread, and priorities shifted from flirting to survival. But oddly, famine also made secret affairs more common. Some scholars suggest desperation pushed people into quick, illicit relationships. So yes, climate change has always messed with dating. Finally, let's end with the big day itself. A medieval wedding wasn't just about 2 people, it was a community event. In villages, the whole neighborhood turned up, sometimes literally following the bride and groom through the streets in a noisy parade. Guests threw wheat or coins, played rowdy music, and sometimes pranked the couple. One French custom? Pretending to block the couple from entering their own home unless they bribed the crowd with drinks. Imagine your wedding reception doubling as a hostage negotiation. Fun times. But here's the truth. Behind the contracts and traditions, these weddings still had the same emotional weight. Families cried, couples kissed awkwardly, and communities celebrated. Underneath it all, it was still about hope. You're walking through a medieval market, dodging chickens and stepping over suspicious puddles. Suddenly, you lock eyes with someone across the cheese stall. That's your meet cute. Markets were where the action was. Not just for buying cabbages, but for scouting potential partners. Families went to display their best produce and their most marriageable children. Imagine your mom casually shoving you toward the fishmonger's son while loudly praising your embroidery skills. Mortifying. And yes, flirting happened between stalls. Buying apples? Perfect excuse for hand contact, lingering eye contact, and maybe a sly joke about fruit. Think of it as speed dating with goats bleating in the background. If markets were Tinder, fairs were Coachella. Seasonal festivals brought whole regions together, dancing, drinking, singing until dawn. Rules relaxed, and young people from different villages suddenly mingled. That meant new crushes, spontaneous hookups, and sometimes, trouble. Chronicles mention fights breaking out between groups of young men competing for women's attention at fairs. Picture a medieval bar brawl, but with cudgels instead of pool cues. And for many couples, these festivals were where secret engagement started. Your modern equivalent? Meeting someone at a music festival and deciding you're soulmates by the third day. Except back then, your parents actually encouraged it. Okay, let's talk bathhouses. Because yes, they existed. And they weren't just for washing. In cities like Paris and London, public bathhouses were surprisingly popular social spaces. Men and women sometimes bathed in the same complex, separated only by flimsy partitions, or not at all. Cue scandalized preachers warning that bathhouses were dens of temptation. Spoiler, they were. Imagine steam rising, scented herbs in the water, cheap wine being passed around. You're supposed to be scrubbing, but really it's the medieval version of a hot tub party. Was it risky? Absolutely. But also, pretty fun. Until, of course, you leave smelling faintly of mildew and someone's sweaty socks drying in the rafters. Not everyone trusted chance. Some people turned to magic. Love charms were everywhere, little pouches filled with herbs, bones, or even nail clippings, worn close to the skin to attract a partner. Some people whispered spells over bread or ale before offering it to a crush. Others tied knots in strings while saying names aloud, hoping to bind someone's affection. Of course, the church hated this, calling it witchcraft. But let's be honest, if you're desperate, you might slip a charm under someone's pillow. Imagine medieval flirting as a mix of awkward glances and very sketchy voodoo starter packs. Now, picture this. You're finally sitting next to your crush. You lean in, and there's Aunt Matilda, glaring at you with the intensity of a hawk guarding her nest. Young women, especially from wealthy families, were rarely left alone with men. Chaperones followed everywhere, at dances, walks, even sitting in the room during conversations. How do you flirt under those conditions? You get creative. Passing notes hidden in prayer books. Using riddles or double-meaning jokes. Even sneaky footsie under long tablecloths. Relatable? Kind of like trying to text your crush while your parents hover over your shoulder. Some things never change. Medieval Europe wasn't as isolated as people think. Trade, war, and travel meant cultures collided, and sometimes fell in love. There are records of English merchants marrying Flemish women, crusaders bringing home Greek or Syrian brides, and Jewish and Christian couples defying social barriers. These unions were often complicated, controversial, and sometimes tragic. But they happened. One famous example, a 12th century Spanish knight who wrote poetry about his Muslim lover, despite knowing their relationship could never be publicly accepted. It's like Romeo and Juliet, but with chainmail and way more political baggage. And then we get to the really juicy scandals, clergy caught in love affairs. Despite vows of celibacy, many priests and monks had relationships, sometimes long-term, even raising children in secret. Local communities often knew and looked the other way. In fact, one medieval bishop admitted the majority of his priests had housekeepers, a polite euphemism for girlfriends. But if caught officially, punishments were harsh: removal from office, public shaming, or exile. Still, the fact that these stories kept cropping up tells us something. Even the most devout weren't immune to human connection. Imagine sneaking out of a monastery at night, sandals squeaking, robe caught on a fence. Not exactly smooth. Medieval dating didn't always happen locally. Nobles often arranged matches across kingdoms, meaning couples might not meet until their wedding day. But sometimes, lovers wrote letters and risked dangerous journeys to meet. Think weeks of muddy roads, thieves, storms at sea, all for a single stolen kiss. One German knight wrote that he would rather die on the road to his beloved than live comfortably without seeing her. Dramatic? Sure. But kind of admirable too. Compare that to complaining about a 45-minute drive for a date. Different worlds, same problem. Long distance is brutal. And of course, we can't talk about medieval dating without talking about consequences. If a relationship went too far before marriage, pregnancies could upend entire lives. Some families forced shotgun weddings. Others abandoned women and left them to struggle alone. Records show heartbreaking cases of young women expelled from households, their babies left at monastery doors. It's dark, but it's real. Love had stakes, which makes you realize how much braver, or more reckless, people were when they risked it all for romance. Not everything was tragic. Medieval people also loved to laugh about romance. Manuscripts are filled with jokes, parodies, and bawdy poems mocking jealous husbands, cheating wives, and hopeless bachelors. One French comic play shows a woman tricking 3 suitors at once, basically medieval sitcom material. Even monks doodled naughty jokes in the margins of holy texts, rabbits with giant phallic swords, nuns harvesting phallic vegetables. Proof that even in the 13th century, people coped with dating disasters through memes. Some things truly never change. So by now, you've walked through markets, danced at fairs, soaked in bathhouses, whispered under candlelight, and maybe even cast a love charm or two. You've seen the joy, the risk, the heartbreak. What does all this tell us? That medieval love was messy. It was supervised, forbidden, celebrated, mocked, punished, and yet unstoppable. And honestly, that's what makes it feel so familiar. Strip away the armor, the dowries, the plagues, and it's still us, laughing, longing, lying awake at night wondering if someone feels the same. So here's my question to you. If you had to live through one part of medieval romance, the bathhouse flirt, the festival hookup, the secret love letter, or the widow's second chance, what would you choose? Drop it in the comments, and let's see which story wins. Okay, let's get dangerous. Because secret meetings weren't just romantic, they could get you killed. Imagine you're sneaking out at night to meet your crush behind the town mill. Your cloak smells like smoke from the hearth, the cobblestones are slick, and every creak of the gate feels like thunder. If you're caught, it's not just a slap on the wrist. Your family's honor is on the line. There are records of young men beaten bloody for sneaking into a lady's garden, and women literally locked away in convents as punishment for being too flirtatious. So yeah, your midnight rendezvous? Equal parts thrilling and terrifying. You think ghosting is bad? Try being dragged in front of the local court for one stolen kiss. Back then, gifts weren't just cute, they were contracts. A man giving a woman a ring or belt buckle wasn't just being sweet, it could be interpreted as a marriage promise. That's why records exist of couples hauled into church court because someone gave a token, then tried to back out later. And the gifts themselves? Practical but loaded with meaning. Gloves symbolized loyalty. Pouches symbolized trust. Embroidered kerchiefs? Basically the medieval version of a hoodie left behind by accident. You're walking around wearing your lover's embroidery like a neon sign saying, "Yeah, I'm taken." Question for you. If you had to woo someone with a medieval gift, what would you give? Comment below, wooden comb, silver pin, or goat? Because yes, sometimes goats were part of the deal. Let's not sugarcoat it. Jealousy got violent. Chroniclers loved juicy stories of men dueling for love. Sometimes it was formal, an arranged combat before a lord to decide who had the rightful claim to a lady's hand. Other times, just drunk guys swinging knives outside a tavern. There's one case in 14th century Germany where 2 knights fought over a woman by literally charging each other on horseback in full armor. One died. The woman? She apparently remarried a year later. Cold. But hey, that was life. It's the medieval equivalent of unfollowing your ex on Instagram, except with more chainmail and higher odds of decapitation. Picture this. You're deeply in love. But your parents? Absolutely not. Maybe he's too poor, maybe she's the wrong religion, maybe they just hate his haircut. So what happens? Sometimes, Couples eloped. They ran off, exchanged vows before witnesses, and then hoped the church would back them up later. Sometimes it worked. Other times, families sent armed cousins to drag them home. And if the father was really serious, he might ship his daughter to a convent to prevent any scandal. Harsh. That's like today's equivalent of sending your kid to a boarding school across the country because you didn't like her boyfriend. Extreme parenting, medieval style. Now here's the stuff of ballads, forbidden love across class boundaries. Peasants and nobles weren't supposed to mix romantically. But, surprise, they did. Servants in noble houses sometimes fell for their masters, or the other way around. And these relationships caused absolute chaos. If discovered, the punishment for the lower-class partner could be brutal: exile, mutilation, or even execution, depending on how offended the noble family felt. For the higher-class lover, a stern lecture, maybe a forced marriage to someone appropriate. It's Cinderella, but with way more blood and no fairy godmother to clean up the mess. Believe it or not, monasteries sometimes played Cupid. Why? Because monks and nuns knew everyone's secrets. They heard confessions, handled wills, and advised families. That made them perfect intermediaries. A monk might suggest to a wealthy widow's family that a certain knight would be a good protector. Or a nun might whisper to her brother about a promising young squire she'd seen at mass. It was matchmaking, cloaked in holy respectability. Imagine your local priest low-key functioning as a Tinder algorithm. You like piety, wealth, and sturdy farmland? I have just the lad for you. Here's a group people forget: widows. Widows actually had surprising freedom compared to young maidens. Once a husband died, the woman often controlled property, money, or businesses. That made her an incredibly desirable match, especially for ambitious men looking to climb socially. Widows themselves had choices. Some remarried quickly, others enjoyed their independence. But gossip flew either way. A young widow marrying too soon? Scandalous. An older widow refusing to remarry? Suspicious. Basically, widows walked around like the VIPs of the dating scene. Today's equivalent? Divorcees with good jobs, nice houses, and zero patience for nonsense. Let's talk about hype men. If you wanted to boost your romantic reputation, you didn't just buy flowers. You hired poets and musicians. Minstrels traveled from court to court, spreading stories of noble lovers, often exaggerating wildly. A knight might pay a bard to compose a flattering ballad about his unmatched devotion to Lady So-and-so. Think of it like hiring a PR team to market your relationship. Today, it'd be like trending on TikTok for writing a sappy love song. Back then, it could make or break your romantic chances. Because if the ballad bombed, everyone laughed at you for centuries. No pressure. Astrology wasn't just for horoscopes in magazines. It was serious business. Medieval people believed the stars shaped your fate, including your love life. Noble families sometimes consulted astrologers to check if two people's charts aligned before agreeing to a marriage. If the planets weren't in harmony, back to the matchmaking board. Even common folk believed in zodiac compatibility. Born under Mars, passionate and fiery. Venus, romantic and indulgent. Saturn, moody and brooding, aka the guy who writes bad poetry in the corner of the tavern. So next time someone asks, "What's your sign?" just remember, people have been using that line for 700 years. Alright, we've talked about courtship, flirting, scandals. But what happened after the vows? Reality check. Medieval married life wasn't always candlelit romance. Couples worked together, literally. Farming, cooking, raising kids, mending clothes, managing debts. Marriage was an economic partnership first, romance second. And children? They arrived fast and often. By the time you're 25, you might have 5 kids clinging to your tunic and another on the way. But here's the twist. Some couples did grow genuinely affectionate. Letters survive of husbands missing their wives deeply when traveling, wives praising their husbands as kind and hardworking. Love could blossom inside practicality. It wasn't fairy tale passion every day, but maybe it was real in a more enduring way. So, what do we make of all this? Medieval dating was wild, risky, tender, brutal, and deeply human. It had all the same ingredients we deal with today: awkward first moves, parental disapproval, bad advice, messy breakups, just cranked up with higher stakes, sharper swords, and way worse plumbing. At the end of the day, love in the Middle Ages wasn't about perfection. It was about survival, connection, and sometimes pure rebellion. Which makes it weirdly relatable, don't you think? Before Tinder, before speed dating, some people in the Middle Ages turned to, let's just say, the alternative methods of finding love. Love charms and potions were everywhere. Women might slip herbs into a man's drink to inspire passion. Men sometimes carried talismans with carved hearts or knots, believing it would bind their lover's soul to theirs. But here's the catch: using magic for love was technically a crime. If the church found out, you could be accused of sorcery. Imagine explaining in court, "No, Father, I wasn't consorting with demons, I just wanted Thomas the miller's son to notice me." Dark, yes, but it shows how desperate and creative people got when faced with unrequited crushes. Admit it, some of you would at least Google love potion recipe if you were stuck in 1348. Now let's talk about the big day, the wedding itself. Spoiler: no white gowns, no fancy aisles, no Pinterest boards. Most medieval weddings were loud, messy, and more about sealing contracts than romance. A bride might wear her best dress, which was usually just her nicest color, blue or red if she was lucky. The vows were spoken in front of a priest or even just at the church door, with family and neighbors as witnesses. And then, straight to the drinking. The feast was the main event. Imagine roasted meats, jugs of ale, rough benches, and someone inevitably throwing up in a corner. If you were noble, sure, there might be music and dancing. But for most people, weddings were chaotic, sweaty, and slightly dangerous. Fistfights weren't uncommon. So, next time you stress about seating charts at a wedding, be glad you're not in a medieval hall where Uncle Geoffrey might literally pull a dagger during the toast. Here comes the part no one likes to talk about: the wedding night. In some communities, this was a publicly acknowledged event. Families wanted proof the marriage was consummated. That means people might literally wait outside the bedchamber for confirmation. In some cases, there are accounts of witnesses being in the room. Yes, like awkward voyeurs, making sure the deed was done. Imagine the pressure. You just married someone you may have barely spoken to, and now half the village is knocking on the door waiting to cheer when it's over. Nightmare fuel. Compare that to modern honeymoons, beaches, cocktails, privacy. Let's just say medieval newlyweds didn't exactly get the luxury package. And here's where things get messy: adultery. Men and women both cheated, of course, but the consequences were very different. A nobleman caught with a mistress? Scandalous, but often shrugged off. A noblewoman accused of cheating? That could ruin her reputation, her fortune, even cost her life. For peasants, it was a bit more balanced but still brutal. Punishments included public shaming, whipping, or forced penance. And remember, villages were small. Secrets didn't stay secret. Imagine everyone at the market whispering while you try to buy onions. That's the one who was caught in the hayloft. So yeah, relationships were risky. In a world with no privacy, every mistake was magnified. By now you've probably noticed, the church was basically the dating app, the marriage counselor, and the breakup court all in one. They decided who you could marry, no marrying cousins too close, though people bent that rule. They investigated secret engagements. They punished people for premarital sex, sometimes dragging them to confess in public. And don't forget, the church also charged fees for marriage licenses, annulments, and blessings. Love wasn't just emotional, it was big business. So next time you complain about modern wedding costs, just know couples have been getting financially squeezed by the system for 800 years. We can't end this journey without touching on the biggest disruptor of love, the Black Death. When the plague swept Europe in the mid-14th century, everything changed. People married younger, faster, and often with less ceremony, because death was literally around the corner. Some couples defied rules, rushing into unions without parental approval. Others abandoned courtship altogether, seeing little point when the world felt like it was ending. And yet, amid the horror, stories of devotion shine through. Widows who remarried for comfort, men who stayed with sick wives despite the danger, lovers who defied curfews to be together. Love persisted, even when everything else crumbled. It's a reminder, even in the darkest times, people sought connection. Maybe that's the most human thing of all. So, what do we take away from this long, strange trip through medieval dating? Love then was raw, dangerous, and tied up in survival. It was whispered in gardens, bargained in courts, sung by poets, and sometimes punished with whips. It could lead to lifelong devotion, or sudden tragedy. And yet, doesn't it all sound familiar? The pressure to impress, the pain of rejection, the joy of connection, the endless rules and expectations. Just with fewer plagues, hopefully, and better hygiene, definitely. Love, in every century, is complicated. And that's what makes it so powerful. And now, this is where you come in. If you made it this far, you've basically survived a full medieval courtship yourself. So, let me ask you, white right pointing backhand index, would you have braved the risks for forbidden love in the Middle Ages? White right pointing backhand index, or played it safe with an arranged marriage and hoped affection would grow? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how many of you are hopeless romantics and how many are realists. And hey, if you enjoyed this dive into the messy, dangerous, hilarious world of medieval dating, smash that like button, share this video with a friend, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the bizarre truths of history. Because trust me, this was just one story. The past is full of thousands more. And together, we'll uncover them all. Until then, stay curious, stay brave, and maybe, leave the love potions in the history books.